I never wanted to step foot in my father's world again. But there I was, standing in the grand courtyard of a 17th century French estate, surrounded by the people who had built their fortunes on the ruins of my mother's life. And golden light spilled from the chandeliers above, casting soft glows on the expensive gowns and tuxedos of the guests. Laughter, polished and insincere, echoed through the marble halls. And at the center of it all, him. My father. Richard Calloway was a man who took whatever he wanted. My mother's company, her dignity, her love. And now he had Claire. She stood beside him, her delicate fingers wrapped around the stem of a champagne flute. She was beautiful in the way that left men breathless, elegance sculpted into every curve. Dark waves of hair cascaded down her back, her emerald green dress clinging to her body like it had been painted on. She looked untouchable. But I knew better. Claire was 39, 14 years younger than my father, 13 years older than me. I still remembered the first time I met her. A year ago at their wedding, when she kissed me on the cheek and looked at me with something unreadable in her eyes. I had hated her then, hated her for standing beside the man who had destroyed my mother. And yet, as I watched her now, something twisted inside me. I was here to ruin him. That was the plan. To remind my father that he wasn't untouchable, that everything he had taken could still be ripped away from him. Claire was supposed to be a piece of that destruction. But as she turned her head and our eyes met across the room, I felt something I shouldn't have. A slow, sinking realization. I had come for revenge, but suddenly, I wanted something else. Her. Claire held my gaze for just a moment too long before turning away. But that moment was enough. Enough to set something shifting between us, something I could feel in the air, humming beneath the polished facade of this evening. I downed the rest of my whiskey and set the glass down on a passing server's tray. The ice clinked, the sound swallowed by the laughter and chatter that filled the estate's grand ballroom. I should have looked away. I should have ignored whatever just passed between us. But I never had much self-control. She moved through the crowd with effortless grace, slipping between groups of socialites and businessmen who barely noticed her passing. My father, too, had already lost interest, deep in conversation with some hedge fund billionaire who was probably just another name in his list of acquisitions. That was Richard Calloway's way. People weren't people to him. They were investments, possessions, assets to be used until they lost their worth. Had Claire lost hers yet? I followed her. Not too obviously, but not too carefully either. She disappeared through an open archway, stepping onto the balcony overlooking the sprawling estate gardens. Beyond, the French countryside stretched into the night, the vineyard rolling down into the valley where soft lanterns flickered in the distance. It was beautiful, in the way only wealth could afford. Yet, Claire stood at the railing, one hand resting against the cool stone as she lifted her champagne flute to her lips. The breeze played with the loose strands of hair framing her face, and for the first time, I noticed something in her posture, a tension, a weariness carefully concealed beneath the polished exterior. "Enjoying the party?" I asked, stepping beside her. She didn't startle. She only glanced at me, the corner of her mouth lifting in something that wasn't quite a smile. "You mean my husband's celebration of himself?" She exhaled softly, turning her gaze back to the gardens. "Yes, it's wonderful." Her voice was smooth, controlled, but I caught the edge of something underneath it, something bitter. I leaned against the railing, close enough to catch the faintest trace of her perfume, something warm, with notes of vanilla and jasmine. It made my stomach tighten. "You don't sound convinced," I murmured. She let out a breathy laugh, low and knowing. "And you don't sound like someone who came here just to support your dear father." So she had noticed me watching her. I tilted my head, studying her profile. In the golden glow of the balcony lights, her skin looked like silk, her lips slightly parted as she took another sip of champagne. "I came to see how things have changed," I said finally. She hummed, swirling the liquid in her glass. "And what do you think?" I hesitated, then leaned in slightly, lowering my voice. "I think some things haven't changed at all." Her fingers tightened slightly around the stem of the glass. The tension between us was thick, an invisible string stretched too tight. Then, suddenly her expression shifted. She turned her head to look at me fully, something sharp and unreadable flashing in those dark eyes. "Be careful, Nathan," she murmured. "You don't know what game you're playing." And just like that, she stepped away, her dress brushing against my arm as she walked past me, disappearing back into the ballroom. I should have let her go. I should have reminded myself why I was really here. But as I watched her slip back into the crowd, I realized something unsettling. I wanted to play. I should have let Claire's words serve as a warning. I should have turned back, refocused on my purpose, on why I was really here. But when she slipped back into the crowd, her dress trailing behind her like liquid emerald, I felt that pull again. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about her. I moved through the ballroom, dodging conversations I had no interest in entertaining. My father was still in deep discussion with his investors, his hand resting on the back of a chair, completely oblivious to the way his wife had left the party, had left me on that balcony with words that felt like an invitation. She was nowhere in sight now. Not in the ballroom, not in the courtyard. But I had a feeling. I moved past the main hall, slipping into the quieter parts of the estate. The air was cooler here, the hum of conversation distant. Then, at the end of the hallway, I saw her. Claire stood in front of an open door, her back to me. Beyond her, a dimly lit study stretched out. Dark wood, rich leather, bookshelves lining the walls. It looked like a place where secrets were kept. She didn't turn, but she knew I was there. I could feel it in the way her shoulders stiffened, in the way her breath caught just slightly before she exhaled. "You shouldn't be following me," she said softly, her voice steady but carrying the weight of something unspoken. And yet," I murmured, stepping closer, "here I am." Slowly, she turned. There was something in her expression, something she was fighting. She looked up at me, her lips slightly parted, her pulse visible at the delicate line of her throat. "This is a mistake," she whispered. I stepped into the study, closing the door behind me. "Then tell me to leave," I said. The words hung between us. Her fingers tightened at her sides, her nails pressing into her palm. But she didn't say it. She didn't tell me to leave. Instead, she took a slow breath and shook her head. "You don't understand, Nathan. You don't know what this will cost." I should have cared. I should have stopped. But I was already too deep. "Then tell me why you looked at me like that tonight," I challenged. "Tell me why you walked away when you wanted to stay." Her breath hitched, her resolve cracking just slightly. I reached out, barely grazing my fingers along her wrist. The contact was electric, sending a jolt up my arm. Her lips parted, and for the briefest second she leaned into it, into me. Then just as quickly she pulled away. "I can't," she murmured. "Not here." The words weren't a refusal. They were a delay, a promise. And just like that, she turned and slipped past me, disappearing down the hall before I could say another word. I stood there, alone in the dim light of the study, my pulse hammering in my ears. This wasn't just a game anymore. This was war, and I was willing to lose everything for it. The party was dying down, The sound of laughter and clinking glasses had faded into the background, replaced by murmured conversations and the distant hum of music playing from the ballroom. But I wasn't thinking about any of that. I was thinking about her. Claire had disappeared after our moment in the study, vanishing into the night like she hadn't just unraveled something inside me, like she hadn't just ignited a fire that refused to go out. I searched for her, not in the crowded spaces but in the quiet ones, the places where she could breathe, where she could escape the life she had chosen. And then I found her. She was in the garden. The moon hung low, casting silver light over the stone pathways and the tall hedges that framed the estate's grounds. Lanterns flickered in the distance, their warm glow barely touching the shadows where Claire stood, her arms wrapped around herself. For a moment, I just watched her. Her dress shimmered under the moonlight, her bare shoulders rising and falling with each slow breath. She looked untouched by the world in that moment, like a secret the night was keeping. But she wasn't untouchable. Not to me. I stepped forward, the sound of my footsteps making her tense. She turned, her lips parting slightly when she saw me. She didn't speak, didn't ask why I was there. Because she already knew. I shouldn't be here, I said softly, but even as I said it, I kept walking, closing the space between us. Claire's gaze flickered, her throat working as she swallowed. Then why are you? I stopped just inches away, close enough to see the rapid rise and fall of her chest, close enough to feel the heat radiating from her skin. She smelled like jasmine and something darker, something warm and forbidden. I don't know, I murmured. It was a lie. I knew exactly why I was here. Her breath hitched when I reached out, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. She didn't move away. She didn't stop me. Nathan. Her voice was barely a whisper, her eyes dark and uncertain. I dragged my knuckles slowly along her jaw, down to the curve of her throat. I felt her shudder. She was unraveling. And I wanted to watch her fall apart. "This is wrong," she whispered, but her body betrayed her, swaying toward me, her lips parting as my hand came to rest against her bare shoulder. I leaned in, my mouth just a breath away from hers. "Then tell me to stop." Silence. Claire's eyes flickered to my lips, her own trembling. She exhaled shakily, but the words never came. She didn't stop me. I tilted my head, my lips grazing the corner of her mouth, just barely, just enough to feel the warmth of her breath against me. Her fingers curled against my shirt, holding on to something, anything. Then she turned her face and kissed me. It was soft at first, hesitant, as if she was testing the weight of the decision she had just made. But the moment my hands found her waist, pulling her against me, something inside her broke. She pressed into me, her lips parting, her hands gripping my shoulders like she needed something to hold on to. I deepened the kiss, tasting the warmth of the champagne she had sipped earlier, feeling the way her body molded into mine. It was reckless. It was inevitable. She gasped softly as my hand slid down her spine, fingers pressing into the curve of her lower back. "Nathan," she murmured. But this time, it wasn't a warning. It was surrender. And I knew then, this wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was something else. Something I had no control over. Claire didn't pull away. Not when my hand skimmed along the smooth fabric of her dress, molding against the warmth of her body. Not when my lips traced the corner of her mouth, when my fingers slid beneath the delicate strap resting on her shoulder. She should have stopped me. She should have stepped back, shaken her head, whispered something about my father or her marriage or the consequences of what we were doing. But she didn't. She clung to me, her breath uneven, her body pressed so close that I could feel the rapid, frantic beat of her heart against my chest. When I deepened the kiss, she parted her lips willingly, letting me taste the last remnants of champagne, and something sweeter, something intoxicating that had nothing to do with the wine. Her fingers curled into the fabric of my shirt, holding on as if she needed something to steady herself, as if I wasn't the very thing pulling her under. The garden around us was silent, except for the rustling of leaves and the distant murmur of voices from the party inside. But here, in the shadows, there was only this, only the slow unraveling of restraint, the quiet surrender in the way she tilted her head, allowing my mouth to travel lower, grazing the delicate line of her jaw. "Nathan," she murmured, her voice catching on my name, but there was no protest in it, no hesitation. I wanted to hear her say it again, wanted to memorize the way it sounded when her guard was down, when she wasn't the poised and untouchable wife of Richard Calloway, but just a woman losing herself in something she couldn't stop. My hands skimmed lower, fingers pressing into the small of her back, feeling the way her body arched into me as if she had been waiting for this, needing it just as much as I did. "You don't want to stop," I whispered against her skin, feeling the shiver that ran through her when I said it aloud. She didn't answer right away, but I felt her hands tighten on my shoulders, felt the way her breath hitched when I traced a path down her spine, my fingertips ghosting over the bare skin exposed by the open back of her dress. "It doesn't matter what I want," she finally murmured, but she didn't pull away. I lifted my head, searching her face, trying to find the conflict I expected to see there, but all I found was something raw, something vulnerable that she was barely holding together. "It does," I said, and I meant it. She exhaled shakily, and for a moment, I thought she would step back, that the weight of reality would come crashing down, shattering this fragile moment before it could go any further. But then her hand slid up, fingers tangling in my hair as she pulled me back to her. And just like that, whatever restraint was left between us disappeared. She kissed me like she had made a decision, like she knew there was no undoing this. It wasn't hesitant this time. It was deep and slow, her body pressing into mine as if she could sink into me entirely. The heat between us was unbearable, igniting something dangerous, something we both knew we couldn't control. My hands roamed lower, over the dip of her waist, the curve of her hips, pulling her flush against me. She gasped softly, but she didn't stop me. If anything, she pressed closer, her breath warm against my skin as my lips found the sensitive spot just below her ear. "We shouldn't," she murmured, but her hands betrayed her, fisting in my shirt, refusing to let go. "No, we shouldn't," I agreed, but I didn't stop. Neither did she. The garden was too open, too exposed, but neither of us seemed to care. My fingers slid beneath the silky fabric of her dress, feeling the warmth of her skin, the way she trembled under my touch. She arched against me, her breath catching as I trailed kisses along her collarbone, my hands pressing her against the cool stone of the garden wall. It was reckless. It was dangerous. And yet, I couldn't stop. She was burning beneath my hands, her body pliant and desperate. And when I lifted my head to look at her, her lips were swollen from my kisses, her pupils blown wide with something that had nothing to do with the crisp night air. "I don't know how to want you and not destroy everything," she whispered, her voice breaking just slightly, as if she hated the admission. I exhaled, resting my forehead against hers, my hand still gripping her waist, unwilling to let her go. "Then let it burn," I said, my voice low, my mouth brushing hers. "Let it all burn." And for the first time, she didn't fight it. She pulled me down to her, pressing her lips to mine, and whatever lines we had been trying to hold on to disappeared completely.